I'm going to talk about David Hockney today. He's a lovely artist and he's from the UK. He's in his 80s. I just checked. He's still doing well. David Hockney, he is associated with pop art and he's very popular. He's a really intriguing artist. I love his portraiture in particular. When I paint, I feel like I'm 30, quotes David Hockney. There's a lot of wonderful quotes from David Hockney. I will put some really wonderful short interviews in the module as well. Recent headlines, or fairly recently, portrait of an artist pool with two figures is set to be sold for an estimated price of $80 million. The current record was set by Jeff Koons in 2013 with Balloon Dog at 58.4 million. He doesn't like the label pop art. He does kind of fit into it though. He's particularly known for his images of his pool. And here he is shown looking into this pool. He's fully dressed and his lover, Peter, is swimming. So the double portrait shows a young man standing on the pool's edge. Again, it is a young Hockney. And he'd broken up a year before. A study for the painting sold for $2.1 million at a 2016 Sotheby's auction. For whatever reason, a lot of people are interested in market value. But swimming pools are one of his muses, according to the Tate, and I would agree. He said, I always loved swimming pools, all the wiggly lines they make. He associates them also with California, and he loves to visit California. Last I checked, I think he even has a home here. Peter with Polaroid. Peter was a UCLA student, 18, when he became close with Hockney, 28. This is a 1977 work. It's a square work, 52 by 52. That's dimensions of Gustav Klimt's The Kiss, or close to it, I believe. Kuhn said, when I made Balloon Dog, I wanted to make a piece that reflected the joy of celebrating a birthday or a party. Balloon Dog is materialism and monumentality, a Trojan horse. I also think it's fun. Now, Koons falls under criticism regularly for being too commercial and having a whole studio that does his work for him. He rarely does hands-on work anymore, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why Koons is not popular particularly, but in the market he's popular. Very brief biography, born July 9th, 1937, so again, just had a birthday. British, very well documented. We have early works, we have late works, we have lots of quotations. He's really quite good at describing his artwork, and it was actually fun to produce this lecture. Numerous exhibits, publications. He's very articulate about his art. This is a very young picture of him. He grew up in a poor household in material things with 5 children, restricted space, but there was a lot of family attachment. Mother religious and vegetarian, father imaginative and against war and smoking. And so there was fairly recently, last few years, incredible exhibition of his works at the LACMA. It was the same exhibition or the same paintings that came from the UK, where they are also on exhibit. But it really was a sensational exhibition. So 1963, a year after he graduates from the Royal College of Art with a gold medal. So he early on had recognition. His first solo exhibition at Casman's Gallery sold out. He decided to spend his earnings on a trip to the U.S. and the promised land of California, in particular, L.A. He said he knew he was going to like California, and he has. He's had a bit of a love affair with California. California themes show up in his work. I think in particular of his work that the LACMA owns, Mulholland Drive. So he, this was one of his beginnings, or his when he became well known. And this was called We Two Boys Together Clinging, which was created in 1961. And many, of course, interpreted the painting to have a strong inclination towards homosexuality. And I think they'd be right, because early on he was trying to find a way to express his sexuality. We two boys together clinging, on the other never leaving, up and down the roads going, was actually quoted from Walt Whitman. Homosexuality was illegal in England at the time. So it's childlike, reminiscent of art brut, childlike art like Jean Dubuffet, but not quite as rough as Jean Dubuffet's work. But it certainly has that kind of playful quality to it. He can draw. One exhibit was actually called I Draw, I Do. So many people are dismissive of modern and contemporary artists, but he does have significant drawing skills. Even today, he uses his iPad and draws quite a bit. Let's see. Hockney exhibit mural, June 2018. Really a really interesting image of his studio and his work, part of his working space here. You can see it closer up. He says he was influenced by Matisse. This is Matisse's Red Studio, Picasso, and Fragonard. Matisse and Picasso, readily recognizable. I'm still kind of looking for the Fragonard, but certainly this was an artist that he enjoyed. But I think a lot of us, when they think of David Hockney, they go, oh, doesn't he do pools? Yes, he does pools, and you can see some of the images of some of his pools. And in particular, these are the ones that often show up in his in textbooks. Like when you do an intro to art textbook, there's usually 1 or 2 pages on Hockney, and it might have that first image that's in the corner there. So, but again, he's perhaps most known for these works. He says, I've been looking at the world all my life, and what I see is rather beautiful. The English artist became famous thanks to his idyllic studies of swimming pools, handsome men who splashed around in them, and these were things he painted in the 60s and the 70s after moving to LA. I think it's nostalgic for me as well. I grew up in Orange County, and you know, in the 70s I had a pool, and I don't know, I think his work does strike a note of nostalgia in this California girl's soul. So this is Green Pool, Diving Board, and Shadow, Paper Pool, number 3, 1978. But I think this is what he's really known for. This has the mid-century modern home. It has really, really clean lines. It's really spare, but then it has that great splash. It's really unique. It's called Bigger Splash in 1967. Again, he grew up in Yorkshire, the 4th of 5 children, in a radical working class family. He loved cinema, and he loved to escape from his surroundings. The Dream Factory of Hollywood was, of course, one of, I don't know, something that was definitely interested in, like many people, I think. Paper Pool, 1978. So California, he said, was everything that England wasn't. And this was explained by Wilson, curator of Tate Retrospective of his work. He did an overview of his career to date. And so in any case, California was a place of fantasy for him, and he still found a way to live it. He loves the high-key colors, and the light and the sensuousness and the sexiness of California. Think of that when you're sitting in traffic. Arrived in the promised land 2 days ago, he wrote on the back of the card, this card. that reproduced the slogan, "Greetings from California, playground of the nation," as well as fresh oranges on a Pacific beach swarming with bronze sun worshippers. So early on, he just thought it was beautiful. He was also a fan of the cult magazine Physique Pictorial, which was produced in LA. As a student at the RCA, he used this Beefcake magazine as a source for paintings and continued to plunder it for imagery throughout the 1960s. This is Domestic Scene, LA, 1963. This would have been very, very early for a picture of two men at this time period. His work was very much cutting edge and very much ahead of its time. And again, I think he's an amazing artist. So Domestic Scene, Notting Hill, and Domestic Scene, Los Angeles. It's interesting how different the palette is as well. Two Boys in the Pool, mid-1960s. Peter getting out of Nick's pool is the second one. And I love the very, very stylized patterns in the pool. Very bold, really, really flat picture planes. A fairly muted palette on the first one. Complementary colors on the second one, the blue with the yellow opposite on the color wheel. So this was based on a Polaroid photograph of Peter leaning against an MG sports car. And so the painting's shape echoes the format of a photograph. A border of unprimed canvas was left to make the picture look more like a painting. So he wanted to emphasize the process of picture making and expose the trickery. He's very, very articulate. He's very interesting to listen to in interviews. Communal swimming pool in the apartment building. So this was, again, Peter Schlesinger. So now we two boys clinging together. Again, the title references Walt Whitman. In 1967, homosexuality was finally decriminalized in Britain. And so he was making work of subjects that he knew and cared about, being a gay man, when you couldn't talk about it or certainly shout about it. He wanted to propagandize homosexuality, and this is from Brown, Portrait of the Artist as a Gay Man. Now, the exhibition that I saw focused on portraits, so this lecture certainly focuses on his portraits, but I do throw some other things in there as well. Portrait from 82 Portraits and a Still Life. This was at LACMA 2018, I think. Una, I'm not even going to attempt that name, daughter of artist Maurice Payne and Brenda, okay, let's try it, Zlamini. Una, who was a junior at Bronx High School of Science, sat on a number of occasions, as did her mother, Brenda. I think her eyes look a little Picasso-esque to me, though. They kind of mismatch, kind of abstracted. But he uses a very, very similar ground and a similar background, and he uses that yellow chair over and over and over again. And then this is a picture of the girl posed with Hockney. So whenever possible, I dug around and found those pictures. So an opinion poll in the UK found 93% of respondents saw homosexuality as an illness requiring medical attention. This is 1965. So for Hockney to be openly gay in this time period, when it was actually seen as punishable, was very, very brave, I think. He was openly gay, but unlike Warhol, he openly explored his sexuality in his work. His most prominent work was, again, We Two Boys Clinging Together. Let me move on. So what I mean by the kind of the eyes looking slightly off or Picasso-esque, usually when I make a comment or throw a comment out there, I'll give you some support for that. I just don't leave you hanging, or at least I try not to. Picasso's Olga, his first wife, Picasso, Portrait of a Woman, Gouache and Ink and Wash, Looking at that going, which of his women does that look like? Maybe Francois, but hard to know. He had many. Here we have the offset eyes again. Marie Therese, of course, it's supposed to be on both sides of her head, but again, it's abstract art. It's okay. Conceptual. Vogue, Paris, December, January 1985. I thought that was kind of showed style as well, and this is David Hockney as well. Picasso's death in 1973 hit him hard. He was a heroic figure to him, and he really, really admired his work. So I think you do see some vestiges of his work in it. This particular image I love, 1970s detail of the artist and model, and he shows himself with Picasso. Picasso's wearing his legendary striped shirt, and so a youthful Hockney sits naked with an aged Picasso. Again, note the rather phallic palm tree above the model, and I think that's a little humor, and he's known for it. He has a very droll, sweet sense of humor. So the walker now owns Peter getting out of the Knicks pool, and so it won Hockney the 1967 John Morse Painting Prize. And again, Hockney was making a name for himself, so he was doing really well. But the pools are what he's famous for. So he goes to LA and begins painting the pleasures of carefree Southern California, and this is another example. And so this is this is what we call an example of appropriation, where he actually took the image and he inserted this male figure, and so this is not by Hockney. It's what we call an appropriation of a Hockney, but even so, I thought it was an interesting work, and it's recent, 2018, by Boersma, acrylic on masonite. I hope people will just see how damn good an artist Hockney was, but also how brave he was. People forget that. He was a brave young man dealing not just with leaving home and going to art school, but also with his sexuality, and finding a successful, witty, and quite cunning way of putting that across. And this is from the Walker Gallery, Liverpool Museum. Another example of man in a pool, very, very spare. David Hockney painting the interior of Andre Emmerich's pool in the 1980s, where he's actually making reality is actually being copied basically from his paintings. So, swimming pool, Los Angeles, 1993. And this is another example of him going through and doing this. This idea of painting a pool after Picasso, in the style of Picasso. In 1961, Picasso painted and signed the bottle of the pool at Villa El Martinet in Marbella, Spain, and this was at a friend's residence. This was in Architectural Digest, and it's a simple line drawing, but it's very cool that it's on the bottom of a pool. Portraits of family and friends. This has been a mainstay. He's always drawn people who are closest to him. His restless pencil is always busy. Early drawings, ghosted with age, depict his family, his neighbors. They're delicate, they're charming. And so this is a quote from Culture of Northern Ireland.org. He looks like a sweet man, just someone you'd pass on the street and you probably wouldn't even give a second glance. Although the Hockney-esque glasses might give him away. This was at the LACMA. So in 2011, he was voted by artists the most important British artist today. I think a lot of people would agree with that. This is a view of the exhibit at the LACMA. Some of these images are mine, some of them aren't. I try to very, very carefully attribute wherever I get images as much as possible. Sometimes they're not available, but this is from LACMA. It said that each of his models sat in a simple chair, and again, the backgrounds are very, very similar. And it was really fascinating to see a huge room of it, and it was a room that had a divider through it, and then you could kind of just go all the way around and see kind of similarities and differences. It was really interesting to see a large number of Hockneys next to each other. This was a still life that was part of the exhibit. It was an anomaly. This wasn't about still lifes, but it had the same background and had fruit. Now, the first one was one that I took, and I think it more closely represents the color at the exhibition, and the second one is from Artsy. And this is a good example of why we like museum visits. You can see the brilliance of the color. Let's see. We move on. So here is a figure of a young woman, one of the more attractive subjects, I think, in the exhibition. So 82 people were done from 2013 to 2016. That's a lot of portraits, but they only took them a few days. They all set for roughly 20 hours. And some of the friends he's known for decades, some were more acquaintances. One was some guy who'd been washing his car since the 80s. But it's rather fun to kind of look at the similarities and the differences. So this is Chloe McHugh, 2013, and then you can see the young girl that was at the opening. You can see the contrast. Some of the blank staring eyes reminded me of Amedeo Modigliani's work. He often has those kind of blank open eyes like this. This is a woman with blue eyes, active early 1900s. Jim McHugh, Chloe being painted by Hockney. And so here we actually have his friend and this young girl. Anyway, it's interesting just seeing how it all comes together. You've seen him in the studio, seeing him working, seeing him paint one figure at one point, and again, and then the other. And so this is Jim McHugh, photographer and father of Chloe. But I love the really jaunty, bright green sweater vest as well. And he's got this kind of, I don't know, impatient look on his face. Now this work is Mr. and Mrs. Clark with Percy. Actually, the cat's name was Blanche, but he liked the name Percy, so he changed it. Why not? He's the artist. So working at an easel, positioned close to the figures, he starts with a spare, simple outline, straight onto the canvas. Some say he uses charcoal, some just, again, sketches it out. He did not allow himself to spend more than 20 hours on any of them. He prevented himself from indulging in the careful, detailed application that is so typical of this particular portrait. This is one of his more important works, and it's, again, Mr. and Mrs. Clark and Percy, 1970s. So he painted them in their apartment in Notting Hill, which is a nice area. This woman, he actually is going to paint a few times. Celia shows up in a few of his works. Ozzy was a dress designer, and like Hockney, the two came from the north of England, and he was actually best man at their wedding. I love the still life of the lilies. And look at the old-fashioned telephone there on the table. The muted color. This is a little different for Hockney, because again, when I think of Hockney, I think of bold color most of the time. And so here you can see they're standing in front of a portrait, and anyway, the lighting, again, it's made to look like a living room, worked from photos. But she did not wear this dress, interestingly enough. This was not something that she wore when she was modeling. He said that he had trouble with Ozzy's feet, so it's a good thing that he buried him in the shag carpet. And this is a more current picture of Celia. And then this is Celia in a black slip reclining 1970s crayon. And then this is Celia much older, Celia Burtwell, Muse, textile designer. And this is 2015. She's gained a little weight, she's gotten a little older. It happened. So she's still a close friend today. And when I first saw this, I have to admit, I thought she looked a little daffy. I was very, very struck by this work. And one of the things that I was annoyed with was, what's with that thing on her nose? It's this little green smudge on her nose. And thinking about it, how he admired Matisse and he loved Picasso, it makes sense. It might be a little ode to Matisse because you have Madame Matisse with the green stripe and that green nose. And that was associated with the fauves. Remember, the fauves means wild beast. They were painting colorful, 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 vibrant works. And they were doing it very artistically in a time when that just wasn't happening. She said, the first time I saw David was at Portobello Market. I was with a friend who knew him. He stood out. He always has. He had on a corduroy jacket, dyed blonde hair. Ozzy was better friends with him, and I used to stay in his studio. I think he finds me a little ridiculous, but there's a fondness there. If I amuse him, then that's a compliment. And so here you can see a picture of the artist in front of the picture in contrast with Cecile, or Celia, I should say. It also reminded me an awful lot about Alice Neal. His style, his bold style, does remind me of Alice Neal, but certainly doesn't have the heavy contour lines of Alice Neal. But just, I don't know, the subject matter, the palette, just reminded me in a few ways of Alice Neal's famous self-portrait. Now, one of the more emotional of the portraits, and the one that when I was looking at, I really wanted to know the background of, was this particular work. And it was J.P. Gonsalves de Lima, and this was his studio manager. And this was the beginning of this huge series of portraits. His 23-year-old assistant died, Dominic Elliott, in 2013. He was under the influence, and he decided to drink a drain cleaner. And Hockney went to his LA studio, unable to work until he started his portraits, but he didn't work for months because, again, this young man died in transit to the hospital. Here we have JP, again, one of the assistants who was just inconsolable. And here he's shown with his head in his hands. So again, he was under the influence. I think he was high on ecstasy, cocaine, and he made this decision. And he was sadly very, very upset because there had been a photo shoot with the famous photographer and Leibovitz. And she wanted to get a picture of all the people who work with Hockney, and I guess he was excluded. I don't know if it was accidental or what it was, but he didn't handle that well, not at all. It really sent him kind of off the deep end, sadly. So this pose, this gesture, is very much reminiscent of Old Man in Sorrow. And it was this pose that is said to have been what brought Hockney out of his artist block, because again, they were all very, very depressed about it. Again, they think the main reason was because he'd been left out of this important Vanity Fair photo shoot. She wanted a picture of the people who worked with David, but he wasn't informed about this happening. And so it was upsetting. And it makes sense as to why he wanted to do all these portraits. So he starts basically documenting all of the people around him and all the people that are associated with him. And so here we have J.P. Gonsalves de Lima. So the sitter tries to evade our gaze. The rug on the floor blazes with sensuous colors, zigzagging patterns. Remember, this isn't plain like everything else. He looks despondent, weary. It reflects his own profound sadness about this event. So, again, he was unable to paint for around 4 months. Kevin Druez is the nephew of Hockney's studio manager. So this image, this painting is exhibit curator Stephanie Barron. She said that the rest of the world just fades away when you sit for David Hockney. And indeed, at the opening, a lot of the people that posed for Hockney even wore the same clothing. Now, she didn't wear the same clothing, but she wore similar clothing, so she's certainly still recognizable. Again, he consistently uses the same background, same details. It really was a remarkable exhibition. Here you can see a picture of the images with the artist posing next to it. And so some of the images class, some of them are complementary colors. But again, the exhibit overall was very, very cohesive. There's an excellent exhibition catalog, which I own. So if you are interested in this lecture, you can get it for a pretty good price online. Joan Quinn, a longtime friend, photographer who's LA based. And so this is an image of her work. John Baldessari, who unfortunately fairly recently passed away. And John Baldessari is an important contemporary artist. He really, really thinks outside the box, or thought outside the box, I should say. But very interesting artist, and certainly one that I probably should spend a little bit more time on. Again, he recently passed away. He was 80, I think he was 88. He was older. But I think this work particularly stood out to me just because I think he's an intriguing artist. He's sometimes inexplicable. I love the pants. The pants on this are great. He is sometimes very animated, sometimes not, but sometimes in interviews he's very stoic. Hockney stated, "I remember his mouth and it didn't move much." And normally he's very animated. But again, he was also posing for a painting. Here we have pop artist John Baldessari. And here he is shown with one of Hockney's pool images, basically giving himself a handlebar mustache. And then we also have a photograph of Hockney pool and swim. This is a portrait of photographer Michael Childers of David Hockney in Hollywood at Rising Glen. I love this work. It's a pretty cool work. It's a very human look at David Hockney, not very formal at all. This is Ivan Schreiber, who is actually a man who has known David Hockney by cleaning his cars, and so they've actually he's actually known him for a very long time. He says he makes jokes and stuff. He's really fun, friendly, generous. I'm a lucky guy to have that responsibility. Sitting for David was interesting. And again, I love the fabrication on the shorts. Very cool. Details are really remarkable. And the shoes are great. Here we have another example of shoes in portraiture here in this example. Reminded me very much of Van Gogh's expressionistic style. We have these working man boots here. A fun fact, Van Gogh walked miles and miles and miles. At one point in time, he even walked just over 100 miles to see his sister. Over 3 days. Do the math. That's a lot of walking. So this is Brian Hastings, 2015. And so here, I love the contrast, the man's skin color against that turquoise blue. So I did like that a lot. I also love the way his hands are done. In fact, that was the way I started this this lecture, because I do love the way his hands are done. So in any case, each of these canvases was around 4x3, so it's a significant size. And mind you, portraiture of the past, grand manner portraitures, was larger, and it's kind of done in that style, but it's not done in a traditional or academic style. It's definitely a lot more looser and a lot more informal. And these are, again, a large cross-section of people that he knows. Not kings, not queens. These are just simply people he knows. And so this is a friend of Hockney's, Brian Hastings. She said, this particular woman, Dominique Desroches, I know David because I worked over 40 years for Yves Saint Laurent, and Mr. Saint Laurent had a great admiration for Hockney, and Hockney the same. So we happened to meet several times. We even traveled together in Sicily. So here she is shown with her painting, and indeed she is wearing the outfit that she wore for the city. She was wearing a brooch, however, that she wasn't wearing in the city. Andrea Alonso, he was looking at me all the time. I'd say, oh my God, my nose, my hair. But the second day it was over, it was fun. David would choose the position of feet and hands. I had to keep exactly the same thing on day after day. I'm like, I'd like to move. So I love the detail of the jewelry. Gee, big surprise. I kind of like jewelry. But in any case, Dominique Desroches, she has these very, very detailed fingernails, glinting rings, and yet she also has a kind of grim expression on her face. And he said with typical candor, she looks very formidable there. This is not called a woman with RBF. Really, it's not. I would call it that, but she has a very, very cranky look on her face, distinctly unhappy, grumpy. And this is Dagny Concoran, a longtime friend of Hockney. And she said it was just nearly impossible to keep a smile on your face for a long time. And so she was painted with this very, very serious, rather grumpy face, I think. So those of you that don't know that slang term, you don't hear it as much anymore, but a few years back you heard it quite a bit. But again, she said it's impossible to hold a smile for 3 days. So, but she again has a pretty grim look. However, again, if David Hockney is painting your picture, I don't know why you'd ever complain, right? Now this is granddaughter of collector Kate Pinos, and also done in a beautiful red dress. I found something I could go on with forever. People are fascinating. They're mysterious, really. And this is a quote from David Hockney. So Kate Pinos. And Rita Pinos, and she's a collector of David Hockney's work. And she shows up in this vivid, vivid skirt that's really quite remarkable. So Kate and Rita Pinos. So she shows up in this rather flamboyant skirt, and shimmering to the floor, painted with a real freedom. The brushwork is really, really active. You can see the strikes, they're kind of bold, and it takes on a crazy life of its own. This was a work I stood in front of for a while, and I love the pearls. You know, you have this vibrant skirt and then a pretty mellow pair of pearls with it. This is Anne Grinstein. She had lost her father just a few days before, and she again has a very serious look on her face. So this is unique. It's two figures, and it is brothers. So here we have the brothers, and then a picture of the dual portrait behind the brother and sister today. And you know, and in this day of gender and questions about gender and gender assignment. So the title is Barry and August Berenger, and it was done in 2014. And August said, well, it's our mother's brother is Ian Falconer, a good friend of David's. They've known each other since the 80s. We were looking at colleges. We're from Connecticut. Our mom asked if we would stop by the studio, and David offered to paint us, so we accepted. It's weird knowing this is going to exist for a long, long time. It was a long time ago, not that long ago, only around 7 years ago. But if you're young, that's a long time. Perry said it was after the junior year of high school, and now we're in our junior year of college. August said, there's a little bit of me that's like, let's do a new one, but that's ridiculous. It just represents a different time in my life, which I thought was a rather philosophical way of looking at it. But again, it's perfectly appropriate in today's world of questions of gender, questions of pronouns. It's very fitting. This is Barry Humphries. He's an actor and comedian, and here you can see a picture of him sitting, and you can actually see the picture, and you can see, it's kind of close. So it's interesting. This is the detail of the work, a close-up, if you will. It's playful and fun, and those pants are just fascinating. So, Frank Gehry, the famous architect. Frank Gehry did a sitting for him as well. And I think this is one of the more beautiful portraits, the beautiful blues, just the little pop of complementary colors of the yellow. Complementary colors, of course, is opposite on the color wheel. It really makes it pop. And so this was painted in 2016. He's a very famous architect today. He's worked with Disney. He's worked with, well, he's very well known. So this was Gehry House in Santa Monica in 1978. People were not crazy about the barbed wire detail. You can see it across the roof line there. The sharp angles, it's industrial style far before its time. So this didn't really particularly go over well. But sometimes even bad press or negative press is good press, because it did get a lot of attention. Taschen Books is a publisher. In fact, they publish a lot of art history books. I love Taschen Books. And so this is a German publisher, and he's an art collector. I love the way he's sitting. His gesture is again, very distinguished. And Hockney clearly paints very often rich people. He's a rich person himself, but he does look very, very affluent in this. I mean, his shoulders are back. Those look like expensive shoes. He looks very well pulled together, and of course, it's an important publisher. So this is Carolyn Cushing Graham, and what was striking when I saw this painting were those boots, those really, really long, high boots. She said, I've known David since I was the West Coast editor of Vanity Fair. I used to go to the studio to see what David was doing. We used to buy published books. I published new works by him, and then I went to the New Yorker, and Tina Brown, the editor, was very fond of David's work. So we published a lot of new work at the New Yorker as well. I used to go up there and talk to David. I met his mother, I met his sister, I met his brothers. And so we get a little bit of the background, and here we can see her in the same clothing and standing in front of the portrait. Helen Hockney, his sister Helen, who was just mentioned. But she, I don't know, she to me looked a little uncomfortable. Boots again. Rufus Hale, this is an 11-year-old son of artist friends. And again, it's unique because it's a child. And so Rufus pointed out that Hockney did not include the eraser on the pencil. So detail oriented. But I love the suit. I love the way he's sitting. It's just lovely. So he probably felt far more restless than Burtwell, and that was his muse, remember, Celia. But Hockney allowed him to have a book and a pen, so this 11-year-old boy sits upright, dressed in waistcoat and tie as he gazes at us directly. He looks very, very serious. Larry Gagosian, the palette's a little different. We got that lavender in the foreground. And this is a very wealthy person. He has sales that exceed $1 billion a year. The Gagosian galleries are pretty much a big deal. Often represents very important artists. And so of the works that stood out, this was certainly one of them because of the difference in the palette. And a portrait, of course, of the artist himself. He's standing in front of one of his works. I love the stripes with the striped picture behind him. This is a detail from David Hockney's self-portrait with Charlie, which will go to the Cartwright Hall Gallery in Bradford. It was in the news. William Wilberforce will travel to Hull, David Hockney to Bradford, and Tracy Emin back to her birthplace and teenage stomping ground, Margate, in a National Gallery project. And again, this was a few years ago. The gallery revealed details of an initiative titled Coming Home, in which 50 portraits from the National Collection will travel to the towns and cities most closely associated with their subjects. So 50 works coming home July 2018. And then this is the whole portrait of the, I just showed you a detail in the prior slide. And so here we have a portrait of the artist, and he's shown with New York curator Charlie Shapes. Hockney stands in the foreground wearing, it says black, but it's not, it's dark blue, shirt with red braces and holding paint brushes, while he sits in the back scrutinizing the work in progress. Hockney is fascinated with mirrors, models, reflection, and has been for years. In fact, he was one that was very interested in the Arnolfini wedding portrait and talked about camera obscura and how it was used in most probability to get very realistic qualities. And this was in his writing Secret Knowledge by David Hockney in 2003. So, and in Arnolfini wedding portrait, in the reflection, you have a self-portrait of the artist who's basically a witness at this wedding portrait or this betrothal portrait or this hand clasping, which it's a very, very famous work. I'm going to go into it at another time, but David Hockney is certainly an important artist.